What's up guys, it's River and today we're looking at the Canon SL3, which is the update to the very popular Canon SL2. But is it really worth the upgrade and who is this camera really for? And I know what you're asking, should I buy this over the cheaper and arguably better Canon M50? Well, to be honest, it's a pretty complicated story. So let's dive right in and figure out exactly what this camera does and who exactly it's for. Let's get into it. So let's jump right into the specs. This camera has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is extremely popular and is actually in most of Canon's top of the line cameras. It also has a DIGIC 8 processor, which is only a slight bump over the SL2 DIGIC 7 processor. It doesn't really change that much in the camera, but it does give you 4K and slightly better autofocus, but more on that later. And one of the best things about the SL3 is the fact that it has a full EF mount on it, which the M50 does not. With the EF mount, you literally have access to the entire range of Canon lineup. You have Canon lenses and you have the third-party lenses, which are some of the best looking and also some of the most affordable lenses on the planet right now. With this camera, you will literally never run out of good lenses to shoot on. And above all else, the Canon colors just look perfect. The reds, the blues, the green are just the right hues. Faces and people look super attractive. There's something about Canon colors where everybody looks good and it has this classic look that everybody adores. So if you do have an ugly friend, use this camera. In terms of photos, it does 5 frames per second in continuous autofocus in full 24 megapixel Canon RAW, which unfortunately sounds way more impressive than it actually is. 5 frames per second at this price point is not that impressive and it's actually not that great. The Canon M50 does 10 frames per second with the same autofocus, so to be honest, it's kind of a letdown. The autofocus in the SL3 is truly impressive. Through the optical viewfinder, you get 9 points of autofocus, which not that impressive, but in live view, you get 3,000 points of autofocus. If you're someone that uses the LCD to compose your photos, you literally cannot take a bad photo with this. The colors look good, the sensor's amazing, and the autofocus is spot on. You literally can't take a bad photo. Sadly, because of the relatively slow speed of 5 frames per second, I wouldn't recommend this camera for action shots or sports, but I actually think this would be a great portrait and product photography camera. And I actually did a quick test shoot with one of my friend's baking companies and the photos came out amazing. I love the way this camera treats colors. The blues and the reds really pop. Everything in these photos seems so vibrant and I did not edit any of these photos. These photos looked good right out of the camera and I was really impressed with the colors. But what about video? Because the reason a lot of people are looking at the Canon M50 over the SL3 is precisely because of what the M50 does differently for video. So this camera does full HD at 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. There is no 24 frames per second or 120 frames per second at 720p. Which obviously puts this more as a camera used for streamers and vloggers or everyday people that aren't professionals. Though despite my calm demeanor, I am upset about the lack of 24 frames per second in this camera. There's no reason for it not to be there other than Canon just being cheap with its consumers. This camera does have 24 frames per second in 4K. However, that 4K comes with a massive, and I mean massive 1.6 times crop, which zooms in all of your lenses and adds a bunch of rolling shutter and soft images. Honestly, when it comes to 4K in most Canon cameras, I would just totally skip it. The only cameras that do 4K properly, probably the EOS R5, R6, and the Canon 90D. However, the one place that the 4K in this camera could be useful is if you're doing a talking head thing like this, or if you're a streamer where your camera isn't seeing that much motion. That 4K is going to be really useful for you guys simply because without motion, you're not gonna see a lot of rolling shutter, and this camera does clean HDMI out in 10-bit color. So if you're a Twitch streamer or a YouTube streamer, you'll find this camera really useful. And this camera does have digital image stabilization, which comes in really handy for handheld work for both photo and video. It's something you won't notice until it's gone, but it's extremely useful. And the autofocus for video in this camera is spectacular. The autofocus for photos is amazing, but for videos, it is just so seamless and simple. It does really good face and object tracking, plus the SL3 has eye tracking. If you're shooting people with this camera, you are literally gonna have no problem whatsoever keeping people in focus. As for videos, I wouldn't recommend this to a cinematic filmmaker, but if you're a vlogger, you're actually gonna have a great time with this camera specifically because of the eye autofocus. And if you're a streamer, you're gonna get great stuff. If you're someone that's a vlogger, a streamer, just kind of an internet personality that wants to create a lot of content, you're actually really gonna enjoy this camera. With that being said, the M50 also has dual pixel autofocus, also has 4K, but it also does 720p at 120 frames per second, but that's not the full story. There's one more thing that we have to look at before we can decide what camera is better for you. So next, let's talk about body and design, because I feel like this is going to be the category that's going to make it or break it for most of you. The body's well designed and extremely compact. The Canon SL3 is actually the smallest DSLR on the camera market right now. And on top of that, it's really well built. It has a really premium feel. I love the way the buttons all have a sandpaper finish. It just feels like a luxury product. The only thing that disappoints me is that it's not weather sealed. It would have been really nice to see for this price point. The ergonomics on this camera are fantastic. It's well laid out and it's easy and quick to work with this camera. And I really like the new simplified mode dial. It's nice to just have the important settings there without having a bunch of clutter on there. And the touchscreen on the back of this camera makes it way easier to work with. You can quickly and easily navigate through all the different settings, change your shutter, ISO, everything right from the screen without having to figure out what button does what or dig through a bunch of menus. And while we're talking about the touchscreen, it's one of my favorite features on this camera. It's a flip out screen that comes out to the side so you can get many viewing angles and also flip it around to see yourself. And on top of that, because it's a touchscreen, you can actually touch to focus on different things, which makes focusing way easier. Software and menu-wise, it's spectacular. Canon cameras are known for their amazing user interface, and this camera is no different. It's really easy to go through the menu. They're really simple. There's really not that many of them. You could literally give this camera to anybody, and it's pretty easy to just pick up and figure it out on your own. And on top of that, the user interface for controlling the actual camera is really snappy, really well laid out. This camera is an absolute pleasure to use, and it's not that complicated. One of the best things this camera and pretty much every Canon camera has going for it is the fact that they're so accessible and easy to use. And if you're a beginner, you're really gonna like this camera because it actually has a creative beginner mode built right in that actually gives you suggestions based on what you're trying to achieve. It'll actually ask you, do you wanna make this more vivid? Do you wanna make the colors like this? Do you wanna make this like this? It'll actually step by step guide you through what you're trying to achieve and help you set up the camera. It's kind of like having your own assistant built into the camera. One place the SL3 really shines that the M50 definitely does not is battery life. The Canon SL2 and the SL3 use the exact same battery, but the SL3 actually gives you double the battery life thanks to the DIGIC 8 processor. I've been shooting non-stop with the SL3 for the last 3 days and I still don't have to charge my battery. The battery life on this camera is truly impressive. And that's probably the biggest thing that sets the Canon SL3 and the M50 apart. The SL3 has things like Creative Assistant built right in, a nice big robust DSLR body style, and a way better battery life. The M50 is a really good camera specs wise, but it's small, it doesn't have an EF mount, it doesn't have the greatest battery life, and it definitely doesn't have a Creative Assistant, which is key for someone that's just starting out and is a beginner that's trying to learn. So the moment of truth, is the Canon SL3 worth buying, and should you get it over the Canon M50? It's a complicated story, but this is my brutally honest opinion. I mean this in the nicest way possible. You should never, ever buy the Canon SL3 unless you're someone that specifically wants to cut no corners and you just want a DSLR beginner camera with an EF mount with a great battery life. You like that body style with the shutter slap and all, and you just don't want to deal with small mirrorless cameras, then get the SL3. It makes sense. You just don't want to deal with the fuss. But if you're someone that cares about specs and what comes out of your camera more than like what your camera looks like or how it feels in your hands, definitely get the Canon M50, because without a doubt, the Canon M50 is a better camera than the SL3. But there's more. The one thing to note is that the Canon M50 isn't an EF mount lens. You only get Canon M lenses, which is the mirrorless lenses. If you want to get EF lenses, you actually have to get a speed booster. However, with the speed booster, you actually go from an APS-C size sensor to a professional full frame sensor, and that speed booster actually makes all of your lenses and images one stop brighter simply because of how speed boosters work. And with the speed booster, the two cameras are actually much more on par, so it really depends, what do you want to use the cameras for? Personally, I recommend the SL3 to someone that doesn't want to have to deal with adapters or all that fuss, just wants a DSLR with long battery life, wants that nice DSLR feel in their hands, and wants to be able to natively use EF lenses with no fuss or adapters. Because one thing to be said about using a speed booster on the M50, your autofocus isn't quite as good. It's still pretty good, but it's not as good as a native EF lens. I don't think I would ever buy the Canon M50 without a speed booster. The Canon M line of lenses simply doesn't have a very good selection, and I don't think they look quite as good as the EF lenses, which are way more accessible and way more affordable. I think the Canon M50 is a really nice budget video camera, and obviously in the right hands, I've seen people put cinema glass with the speed booster and it looks incredible, but I think I'd rather stick to the SL3 just because I've got my native EF lenses, no huss, no fuss, great battery life, I like the body feel. The M50, it's a little too small for me, it's a little too anemic, and I don't like the short battery life. And I don't love the idea of reducing my autofocus with a speed booster. I think the SL3 is for someone that wants to get a camera that works really well right out of the box, no fuss, and the M50 makes more sense for someone that's willing to jump through a few hoops, maybe a young cinematographer or a filmmaker that wants a full frame look on a budget.